On the picturesque Portuguese island of Madeira, a 34-year-old man lay dying on his sickbed. Between agonising coughing fits, he managed to turn towards his wife Zita, who was pregnant with their 8th child, and whisper his final words, "I love you so much." It was a poignant end to a monumental era. Karl I's unlikely transformation from a somewhat obscure grand-nephew of the emperor into the Habsburg ruler himself was only made possible by the countless tragedies that befell the ailing Austro-Hungarian Empire, a curse that would end once and for all as the last emperor scrambled to piece together the shattered remains of a 600-year-old dynasty. Here is the life of Karl I, and this is Crown Undone. On the 17th of August 1887, in the castle of Persenburg, Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony gave birth to her first child during the reign of her uncle-in-law Franz Joseph. The 20-year-old princess had married Archduke Otto Franz a year earlier under growing pressure from the Austro-Hungarian imperial family. Vienna was desperate for an alliance that would repair the Habsburgs' strained relationship with the royal dynasty of Saxony, after both Rudolf, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Otto's older brother Franz Ferdinand had rejected Maria's sister Matilda. Although the marriage between Otto and Maria did soothe the Habsburg-Saxon rift, Matilda personally resented the rejections, and though she did go on to become an accomplished artist in her lifetime, she died in 1933 without ever having married. After Otto and Maria's much-anticipated wedding in 1886, Maria gave birth to Karl in 1887, and Maximilian was born in 1895. Before Karl's second birthday, tragedy struck the Habsburgs and plunged the line of succession into its first round of turmoil. The only son of Franz Joseph, Crown Prince Rudolf, had just been discovered dead in an imperial hunting lodge in Ailing, with the corpse of his mistress by his side, gunshot wounds through each of their heads, and a revolver in Rudolf's hand. Rudolf had been primed for his role as emperor since his birth in 1858, and with no brothers of his own, the question of who would become Franz Joseph's new heir was in dire need of an answer. Since Franz Joseph's sibling closest in age, Maximilian, had already been executed at the hands of Mexican Republicans 3 years into his stint as Mexico's emperor in 1867, the Habsburg inheritance was passed on to Franz Joseph's other brother, Karl Ludwig. By the time he became heir presumptive in 1889, Karl Ludwig was married to his third wife, Maria Theresa, the second eldest daughter of Portugal's deposed king, Miguel I. While Maria Theresa gave birth to 2 daughters during her marriage to Karl Ludwig, she also became the stepmother of Karl's 4 children from his second marriage. These 4 children included Franz Ferdinand, Otto Franz, Ferdinand Karl, and Marguerite Sophie. So the young Karl's grandfather was suddenly heir to the throne, and the Habsburg crown seemed to be inching closer. The devoutly Catholic Karl spent much of his young life wherever his father's regiment was stationed. He received a private education, but was also one of the few Habsburg royals to attend a prestigious public school for certain subjects. In 1896, Karl's grandfather and the second in line to the Habsburg throne, Karl Ludwig, contracted dysentery after drinking water from the River Jordan during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and although he made it back to Vienna, he died shortly afterwards at 62. Karl Ludwig's eldest son, Franz Ferdinand, became heir presumptive upon his father's death, but the line of succession was disrupted once more when Franz Ferdinand married the Czech noblewoman and lady-in-waiting, Countess Sophie Kotek. Although the Emperor Franz Joseph initially refused to permit the marriage because of Sophie's lack of royal blood, he finally assented under the condition that the couple's children could never ascend the throne. Neither Franz Joseph nor any of Franz Ferdinand's brothers attended the ceremony when the couple married on the 1st of July 1900. Franz Ferdinand's stepmother, Princess Maria Theresa, and her 2 daughters were the only members of the imperial family at the wedding. Although Franz Ferdinand would remain heir presumptive, his future children were struck off the line of succession, leaving his younger brother Otto next in line. At about the same time though, it became clear that Otto, Karl's father, was suffering from the effects of syphilis. He had already sired at least 2 illegitimate children, and it was probably during one of these extramarital affairs that he contracted the infection. Although his condition temporarily improved after spending a year convalescing in Egypt, once he returned to Austria, Otto's health was deteriorating rapidly. The Archduke even had to have his nose replaced with a rubber prosthetic because of the facial deformities caused by the STI. Otto died from the disease on the 1st of November 1906 when he was 41. At the time of his father's death, Karl had finished his studies and joined the army as an officer stationed mostly in Prague. There he studied law and political science alongside his military duties. Karl spent the next few years of his life in the military, with the knowledge that he would one day succeed Franz Ferdinand as the heir presumptive, and then as the Habsburg Emperor. Karl's relationship with Franz Ferdinand, though, was tense, and he was consistently excluded from any conversations about the affairs of state. He was living the life of a prince, not a future emperor. In 1909, while his regiment was stationed in Bohemia, Karl started to pay regular visits to Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Zita had been born in 1892 to Infanta Maria Antonia of Portugal and the deposed Duke of Parma, Robert I. Robert had fathered 12 children during his first marriage before his first wife, Princess Maria, died in childbirth, and then he went on to have another 12 children in his second marriage. Zita was Robert's 17th child. Like Karl, Zita was brought up as a devout Catholic, and 3 of her sisters ended up becoming nuns. Zita later recalled that in the autumn of 1910, rumours spread about that I had got engaged to a distant Spanish relative, and on hearing this, the Archduke came down post-haste from his regiment. He asked if the rumour was true, and when told it was not, he replied, "Well, I had better hurry in any case, or she will get engaged to someone else." Karl proposed to Zita in June 1911, and the pair were married in October. The 81-year-old Franz Joseph was thrilled by the match, and even led a toast at the wedding breakfast. Their first child, Otto, was born the next year, and over the next decade, Zita would give birth to 7 more children. In what became one of the most calamitous moments in modern history, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. The couple had already miraculously escaped an earlier assassination attempt that day, when a member of the revolutionary Young Bosnians hurled a grenade at the convertible that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were inside. As the pair were driven to visit the victims of the day's earlier bomb attack, the car that they were in stalled, and within minutes, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dead. Behind the semi-automatic pistol stood Princep Gavrilo, a 19-year-old Serbian anarchist who never could have foreseen the global fallout that came from the barrel of his gun. It was the spark that ignited the First World War. Although he was born 5th in line to the Habsburg throne, the deaths of 4 of his relatives, alongside a marriage that excluded 2 more, meant that in 1914, as the empire was on the brink of war, Karl became heir presumptive. In fact, Zita remembered that when they received the news of Franz Ferdinand's death, she said of Karl, "Though it was a beautiful day, I saw his face go white in the sun." The assassinations ultimately led Austro-Hungary to go to war with Serbia, but what Vienna had expected to be a short and isolated conflict turned into one of the most deadly wars in history. Russian support of Serbia brought its ally France into the conflict, and Germany's unstinting support of Austria-Hungary saw Berlin declare war on Russia and France, while Britain declared war against Germany days later. Once the conflict had begun, Karl took command of the 20th Corps during the Austro-Hungarian offensive against Italy, and was then sent to command the aptly named Army Group Archduke Karl on the Eastern Front. By the end of 1916, 2.5 years into a war that had already killed 500,000 Austro-Hungarians, the 86-year-old emperor was dying. Having ruled for nearly 68 years, Franz Joseph died from pneumonia on the 21st of November 1916, leaving his great-nephew Karl in charge of an empire that had never seemed more precarious. Since there had never been a coronation ceremony for the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a whole, Karl's crowning in Budapest as the King of Hungary on the 30th of December symbolised his inauguration as the head of the entire empire. As per tradition, Karl could not try on Hungary's holy crown before the actual coronation, so when it slid slightly sideways after it was placed on the emperor's head, some saw it as a bad omen. although the new emperor was considered politically naive. In fact, the Austrian prime minister was reported to have said that Karl is 30, he looks 20 and thinks and speaks like a 10-year-old child. He was still committed to finding a way out of the war. In 1917, Karl sought out help from his brother-in-law Prince Sixtus, who was an officer in the Belgian army, to discuss peace terms between Austria-Hungary and the Allies, but the secret talks broke down in July the same year. Intent on driving a wedge between Germany and Austria-Hungary, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau publicised Karl's peace talks, prompting Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II to summon the new Habsburg Emperor to his headquarters. Although the meeting supposedly remained civil, Karl was made to agree that Austria-Hungary would be subordinated militarily, diplomatically, and economically to Germany's own war aims, facilitating Berlin's complete takeover of the Austrian army's factories and railways. In an attempt to deal with a worsening food supply crisis, Karl reconvened the parliament in Vienna for the first time in 3 years, and soon 2,500 political prisoners were released, but it was too little too late. By the time Berlin began negotiations for a ceasefire in October 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doomed. Despite issuing a manifesto that promised to arrange the empire along new national boundaries, on the 11th of November, Karl proclaimed that he would relinquish every participation in the administration of the state, but he carefully avoided any mention of a formal abdication. In fact, in a letter to the Archbishop of Vienna, Karl wrote, "I did not abdicate and never will. I see my manifesto of the 11th of November as the equivalent to a check which a street thug has forced me to issue at gunpoint. I do not feel bound by it in any way whatsoever." A British military unit was sent by King George V, who was haunted by the deaths of the Romanovs, to escort Karl to his new life in exile in Switzerland, and the day after he left, Vienna's parliament declared a republic. From exile, Karl attempted twice in vain to reclaim the throne of Hungary. The second attempt failed so disastrously that dozens of people were killed in the skirmish that broke out between troops loyal to Karl and Hungary's government forces. In November 1921, Karl, Zita and their children were sent to Portugal's Madeira island to live out the rest of their exile, but the 34-year-old's life wouldn't last long. After suffering from several heart attacks and developing pneumonia, the last Habsburg Emperor, alongside any dreams of a Habsburg restoration, died on the 1st of April 1922. 80 years later, on the 3rd of October 2004, Karl was beatified by Pope John Paul II, earning the title the Blessed by the Catholic Church. That was the life of Karl I, and this was Crown Undone.